One of the most popular things to discuss in the Overwatch community for quite a while has been counter-swapping. Most of the time, playing the tank role can't even be brought up without it. It has been listed as one of the most negative cons of 5v5, and one of the main reasons to even return to 6v6 in the first place. However, is this even true? Is counter-swapping as it's known in Overwatch today even that big of a problem? Or is it just something that looks and sounds a lot scarier than it actually is? Today I will be discussing whether counter-swapping works or not, and even the times it is a bad idea to counter-swap in the traditional sense. Hey guys, welcome back to another Overwatch video, and today we'll be talking about the merits of counter-swapping, and seeing how effectively it actually is. Make sure to like, subscribe, check out my Twitch and bio, and let's just get right into it. So what is counter-swapping anyways? To most, it's obvious, but I think it's helpful to define it, as it's the main term we will be talking about. I'm defining counter-swapping as the intentional swapping of your hero based on what heroes the enemy have, but usually the tank in particular. It's something practiced since Overwatch 1, but has really come into full public discussion as a problem in Overwatch 2. This is because with a swap from 6v6 into 5v5, the amount of variety and different heroes your team can run is lowered. This means your team composition is much more limited in what it can and cannot do. Meaning, unlike before, where your D.Va had counterplay from Zarya with something like a Reinhardt shield, she has no direct way of blocking Zarya from just hard beaming her. Another thing to note in the transition between Overwatch 1 and 2 is the addition of new heroes. As more heroes are introduced, you naturally have more options. Part of why I think counter-swapping wasn't that big of a problem in Overwatch 1 is that most of it you simply couldn't. Until Brig and Moira, there wasn't really a support you could swap to if you wanted to counter a flanker or a dive hero. Even in the tank role, something like Overwatch 1 Sigma or Orisa can be annoying to play Reinhardt into, but depending on the map and your teammates, it could honestly be counter-swapping for you to play Reinhardt into them. This obviously isn't the only reason, but I think it's something to consider when talking about it, especially when we had these new heroes in the 6v6 playtest. So now that it's better and so prevalent in Overwatch 2, what does counter-swapping look like? Well, usually after the first or second fights, and even sometimes as soon as the round begins, they will go back to spawn and swap based off usually one specific player, which 99% of the time is the tank. It's been around so long that the community and player base has perceived and known counters for every tank. D.Va, and you might swap Zarya, Mei, or Sim. Winston, and you could play Reaper, Bastion, or Roadhog. And Reinhardt is usually Ramattra, Mei, and Pharah. Of course, there are other heroes that are played for these characters, but these are just some of them. Now, does this very common counter-swapping trend actually work? I believe the answer is sometimes. Well, I believe that depends on two main factors that counter-swapping's effectiveness is decided, those being map and the other heroes on both teams. Let's take Sigma, for example. One of the most commonly played tanks against him is Ramattra. This is because you can easily run at him, and Sigma has no way to stop you outside of Rock, which is only a 1 second stun, and in the long run, doesn't really help too much. However, this matchup can easily be flipped. On maps like Circuit Royale and Havana, which are much longer and more narrow, Sigma suddenly can win the matchup easily. You can pressure Ramattra constantly, and when he uses his form, you should easily have enough space to where you can back, and your team can shoot him while he runs in the open, and which shuts down his push. However, this can also be changed by his teammates. If the Ramattra has a Lucio or Juno, then the map geometry matters a lot less. However, if the Sigma has an Ana or Zen, then it's a similar story, as now the Sig can take his advantage back, as there are more ways to stop the Ramattra push. See how it's more complicated than it seems? Because of those variables, it can often become a bad idea to attempt to counterswap. If you just blindly play Zarya into D.Va without noticing their Bastion or Junkrat, you're going to struggle, as your bubbles are broken in less than a second, and D.Va can just freely shoot into you. Same idea with Reinhardt into Zarya. Your shield does indeed block Zarya's beam, but if your shield is also taking pressure from two other high damage characters like Pharah, Junk, Bastion, etc., then the Zarya can just walk as if you ever drop your shield to actually scare the Zarya, you're essentially dying instantly, unless someone else is taking the pressure off. You also need to have a basic knowledge of the character. Mauga does counter Roadhog, but if you don't know how to manage your cooldowns and properly position, he can beat you easily. Just because you're playing Winston doesn't mean it's GG if your opponent locks Hog or Mauga. On top of that, another aspect is that you actually have to know what to counter swap to, because the whole point of swapping is to give yourself an advantage, but if you're not actually swapping to the character with an advantage, you're probably worse off than if you just stayed the same hero you were, because now you're losing potential ult charge alongside perk progress that you could be getting. I had one game where my support thought Moira is a better hero to play into Winston Genji dive than Brigitte. Because of this, we ended up at a greater disadvantage than what we were previously at. Unlike Brig, who can heal through Winston barrier and CC to stop the Genji dive and Winston dive, Moira, as soon as Fade is used, is a sitting duck, yet the Winston and Genji actually have a brain. Keep in mind that this person was flaming one of our DPS to swap Reaper to counter swap their Winston. Another example of this is something like playing Ramattra into Zarya. If your thought process is simply, I have a barrier which prevents Zarya beam, therefore I win. You're going to find yourself surprised quickly as the Zarya waits it out and then proceeds to be able to duel you easily as you are forced into Nemesis form. However, I think the most important thing to look at when you're counter swapping in this game is your teammate hero picks. Depending on what they play and what they swap to, you could be giving the enemies an advantage and your team a disadvantage. Let's take the Reinhardt into Zarya matchup again. This time they're running much less of a direct anti-Rein DPS comp, with something standard like Cass Genji. On paper, it should be extremely easy to get a ton of value on Reinhardt. However, this doesn't end up happening. This is because your teammates are playing Widowmaker, Sombra, Mercy, and Zenyatta. This comp translates to Reinhardt very easily having its potential value negated and your team remaining at a disadvantage. Why is this so? Well, for starters, you have no frontline pressure. Your Widowmaker is going to be on high ground somewhere looking for an angle, and your Sombra is going to be in the backline, or near there most of the time, which means you have very little frontline pressure outside of yourself. On top of that, your supports can't enable you aggressively well at all. Your Mercy only has flat healing, which if the Zarya can manage charge well, she'll clean right through. Alternatively, she could be pocketing your Widow, which would help her against the Genji dive, but make you as Reinhardt even less scary offensively. In conjunction with this, Zen heals aren't very helpful notoriously, and Discord can be removed by Zarya Bubble. In this scenario, Sigma would be a better pick than Reinhardt, even though Zarya can be thought of as a counter to Sigma. It would enable your team a lot better. You'd be able to deal damage easier and without demanding a massive amount of heals every time you try to deal damage. But does this mean your whole team should counter swap? Well, if it's not just targeted at the enemy tank and mindful of the map, I don't think that's a terrible idea. But who has the most responsibility to counter swap? I would say it lies mostly with the supports. And I don't just mean Ana or Zen always. Now, why do I say this? I think it's because supports have the most they can do in the correct matchup, even enabling teammates to pick heroes that could be considered being countered by the enemy heroes. Let's take the game I mentioned earlier about the Moira player. If they were on Brig, it would have enabled us much better as compared to someone playing Reaper to Winston. Even if you miss your whip shot, the mere increased survivability you have will give us a much longer window to trade backlines or help you survive the dive. Compared to how Reaper can easily be zoned out by Winston Bubble, and if he's not shooting at Winston, then there really is no point of swapping Reaper. If you stayed on something like Ashe or Soldier, you can even be better enabled because of your Brig swap. You giving them packs while they're getting dive is a complete game changer, compared to Moira only being able to send a slow moving orb that is unlikely to even get half of its value off it. Moira isn't a good hero, but the argument goes far beyond cherry picking, as even if they're on a better hero, like Lucio, Kiri, or Ana, it's a similar story. Kiri can Sizu or TP out, but even if one of those cooldowns are used, she's going to be having a lot of damage coming her way. Lucio can boop, but if that's blocked or used before they use their cooldowns, then even if you amp, you are still taking a lot of damage, and most likely dying. Ana has the best chance with her cooldowns, but still has to manage them well, and have them not get blocked by Winston Bubble. And even if one of them dives you while the other dives your teammates, they're not going to be getting healed unless you play basically perfect. I could go on, but even playing Ana by herself shuts down most ground tanks, alongside Zen. Outside of the Brig Ana Zen trio, Kiri is a great counter to Junker Queen, because you have Suzu for carnage and just cleansing wounds, and you can completely negate her ultimate. So if you're going to complain about tank and DPS, not counter swapping, make sure you yourself are also playing a good support too, because I think that's more important. The name itself is support, and if you're not supporting your team by playing a good hero, then maybe you should check yourself before talking to other people. So in conclusion, does counter swapping actually work? I would say yes, but it's complicated. If you do it blindly, it can be punished, and if it's not a team effort, especially from supports, then it's much harder to actually pull off the strategy. Especially with the addition, perks, the counter swapping strategy has only gotten worse. However, if you enjoy making the enemy tank not enjoy the game, and you're doing counter swapping properly, then I think it can show promising results. Thanks for watching this far, hope you enjoyed. My name is Excel, make sure to like, subscribe, check out my Twitch, and have a great day.